One question I get asked a lot is, do I need to have a solo podcast or should I do an interview podcast? And my answer is honestly, why not both? Why do you have to choose? Why does it have to be one or the other? So we are going to discuss this today. So let's get right to it. Hey potty people, Crystal here today, and we are talking about having a solo podcast versus having an interview podcast. And I'm going to be the first one to tell you that it is your podcast. You make the rules. You are the one that gets to decide how you want to create content for your show. Now, are there pros and cons to having a solo podcast versus an interview? Absolutely. There are pros and cons to each of them, which we're going to explore those in a second, but I just want you to know that the decision is ultimately up to you. Even after everything we talk about here today, if you decide, I really just want to do solo episodes, or I think that interviews are the way to go for me, or I think I want to do a mixture of both, none of these answers are wrong, okay? So I wanted to come out of the gate and let you know that there are no wrong answers here. So let's talk about solo podcast. I love solo podcasts because it gives me the freedom to create content without having to work around other people's schedules. This is actually one of the reasons why I really love solo episodes, because I could batch record multiple episodes, like 2 or 3, and like start to plan for the content that I want to create over the next few weeks without anybody else's say. I don't have to wait for a scheduled call. I don't have to wait for, somebody had to cancel because something came up. I could just go to my office and record a podcast episode, or 2 or 3 or 5. I could record all of my content for an entire year if I wanted to, because it's my content and I have a say in how it's created in a solo episode environment. So those are the pros to having a solo podcast. Now, the cons are the conversation's one-sided. It can be a little tricky. If you're not comfortable talking by yourself in a room, whether you're recording in an office or a closet or a car, like wherever you're recording, it can be tricky. I'm not gonna lie, solo podcasting, it is definitely a skill that not everyone has, and that's okay. We're gonna get to interviews here in a second, but I think that the biggest con to having a solo podcast is the same thing as the pro. You're relying on yourself. So it's a pro because you don't have to deal with other people's stuff, right? You could just do it all on your own. But the con is you have to do it all on your own. You have to be disciplined to make it work whenever it comes to solo podcast. Now, let's talk about interviews, because I love interviews. Interviews are how I started my podcast journey, and I did roughly 20 or so interviews before I ever even attempted to do a solo podcast, because I truly believed that podcasts were all interviews. I didn't listen to a lot of podcasts where they had solo episodes. It was mostly like call in, like kind of like a radio show where people would at least have someone to interact with. There was dialogue on most of the podcasts that I listened to. So that's what I knew. And what I love about interviews is you do have that back and forth. It's not just a one-sided, one perspective. And I think that there's a lot of things that are spontaneous that happen in interviews that don't often happen in a solo episode. Don't get me wrong, I tell lots of fun stories. If you haven't checked it out, this is my podcast, the Proffitt Podcast. We put out brand new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, but there's been some spontaneous moments in my solo episodes where I'll tell a fun story that I think about, but I think that the interviews is really where it's at, because you can have conversations and ask questions from your perspective or maybe your listeners. I often do that with my interviews. I think about, if my audience was sitting here right now, what question would they ask? Plus, you also get the opportunity to promote someone else on your platform, or hopefully they're going to share their interview across their platforms as well whenever it goes live. So those are the pros of having interviews. Let's talk about the cons. The cons are obvious. We already talked about them earlier, but schedules. Y'all, it's hard sometimes to have your schedule align with your guest. Maybe you have a sick child for yourself. You're like, I gotta reschedule. And then maybe the other person is like, oh, now I have a scheduling conflict. Like I have to back out or I have to reschedule. And then let's just be honest, there's those wild cards that come into your sphere that you're like, oh, this is gonna be a fantastic interview. And then it turns out to not be. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. If you've had a bad or awkward interview, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That is a con of interviews. It's kind of a crapshoot on whether or not you're going to have a fantastic conversation with your guest, which is why I prefer option number 3. So we talked about solo episodes. We talked about interviews. What is option number 3? Option number 3 is a mixture of both. I love to have the option of taking summers off and being with my kids. I have 3 kids and I don't like to do a lot of interviews during the summer. So what do? I can either batch a whole bunch of episodes. You can watch this video right here all about batching podcast episodes. But if I don't batch, then I just decide I'm going to record a bunch of solo episodes because I don't have to worry about interviewing anybody. Plus, it's really hard to interview people when there's 3 screaming kids at home that want to do this and want to go here and want to go there, and it's like all over the place. So I just don't do interviews at all over the summer, and I love having that flexibility. I've given that to myself. It was a gift to myself and to my podcast to take summers off from interviewing, so I do a lot more solo episodes. But I also love that I can add in interviews because it adds different experts. It shares them with my audience. It adds a different perspective, but also it adds great resources. I love sharing interviews with you. I actually have a whole bunch of interviews coming up very soon that I'm going to be sharing here on the channel that you can watch the awesome conversations that we have. You can learn from the experts that I've interviewed, and I wouldn't be able to do that had I not done those podcast interviews. So I can't tell you which choice is going to be right for you. Just solo, just interview, or a mixture of both. Only you can make that decision. But I want you to know that there are no wrong answers. Okay? I want you to decide on what is going to work best for you and your podcast and your audience. And at the end of the day, if you decide, I feel like I picked the wrong one, I think I want to change things up, go for it. You can always make changes in the future. Once you decide on one thing with your podcast, you're not married to it forever and ever. Amen. If you want proof of that, go check out my podcast, the Proffitt Podcast, because I've definitely changed so many things over the course of my podcast. We're almost at 300 episodes as of me recording this video. So yeah, we've done lots of ups and downs and turnarounds and pivots and all the things. And if you want to see an example of that, go check out the show. But that's all I have for you today. So I hope you were inspired to pick a format that works best for your podcast. And if you have any other questions about having a solo show or an interview, put them in the comments below. But make sure you hit the thumbs up on this video if you found it helpful. Subscribe below. That way you don't miss our future videos all about podcasting and running your online business. Check out these other videos right here, all about podcasting and running your online business. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.